Hi, everyone. Welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I cannot tell you how happy I am to have you here and listening to me talk about true crime. Now, for those who have just tuned in or might be a new listener, and as this is a brand new podcast, I dare say that would be a lot of you. My podcast is I talk about true Aussie murders, and I tend to talk about the not so talked about Aussie murders, if that makes sense. The Aussie murders that really don't get talked about. I will, of course, touch on the bigger ones as we go down the track, but I will be talking about the more unheard of murders and shedding a bit of light on those. And of course, I do it over a cup of coffee, or I can do it over a drink or a cocktail or a cup of tea. And you are more than welcome to do the same with me, depending on whatever grabs us, guys. Now, I can tell you tonight, I am drinking black coffee with pumpkin cinnamon syrup. And I have to say, I don't know if I like the syrup. I'm undecided. But anyway, I'll give it a red hot go and we'll go from there. So, welcome, guys. And I need to give a warning for this episode. It is about infant murder. It is about little babies being murdered. So if this is not your jam, if this is not what you want to listen to, this is not the podcast for you today, my friends. But if it is, grab your beverage, grab whatever you want to drink, grab your caffeine, and settle in, guys, because I have an absolute doozy of a tale for you. Okay, on today's episode, I will be talking about baby farmers John and Sarah Makin. Now, the sources for my show tonight, guys, are Murderpedia and adb.anu, edu.au/biography/Makin Sarah Jane 13271. Now, before I go any further, the definition of baby farmers is the historical practice of accepting custody of an infant or child in exchange for payment in late Victoria, Britain, and less commonly in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. If the infant was young, this usually included wet nursing, which is breastfeeding by a woman, not the mother, and some baby farmers adopted children for lump sum payments while others cared for infants for periodic payments. Now, this brings us to John and Sarah Makin, baby farmers. And on today's episode, I'll be talking about this rather charming couple, John and Sarah Makin, who lived in the inner western Sydney suburbs, such as McDonaldtown and Redfern, Australia, in and around 1890. And it was in one of those homes that after a worker, while clearing an underground drain in the backyard of a home in Burren Street, McDonaldtown, which is an inner west Sydney suburb, maybe about half hour away from Sydney, found the shocking reason for the blockage of the drain. It was blocked with the remains of two infant children. Now, the police quickly arrested the Makins. It didn't take them long to find out who had previously lived in the house, along with four of their daughters, but only John and Sarah were charged. Now, police also dug up the backyards of 11 other properties that the Makins had lived in and found a total of 12 infants buried in those backyards. 12 little babies. Can you imagine finding those little souls? I couldn't even begin to imagine. It was put to the couple that they took in these babies from desperate parents who were often unwed single mothers who couldn't afford to raise their babies but wanted them to be well cared for, wanted them to have a better life than what they could provide. And in returning for taking in the child, the Makins would receive the parents' childcare payments. And they would also take fees for looking after their babies. This, as I've just said, was known as baby farming, and it was an awful practice where the baby farmers took advantage of desperate parents, desperate mothers who just wanted to give their child a better life, and sadly was very common practice in the 1800s. Now, John and Sarah were farmers, and Somewhere along the line, they decided it would be easier to kill these babies and still take the payment for them than to actually care for them. And they did this, that we know of, a total of 12 times. John Makin was born on the 14th of February 1845 in Dapto, New South Wales, and was the fourth of 11 children to William and Ellen. Sarah was born on the 20th of December 1845 and was the only child of former convict Emmanuel Sutcliffe and his Irish wife, Ellen. Sarah had already married and was divorced by the time she met John. Now, Sarah had initially, her first husband was sailor Charles Edwards. They were married in 1865 and had a daughter together, but for whatever reason, the marriage didn't last. So Sarah, the spinster, oh the horror, and John crossed paths in Dapto, though I couldn't find out how they met, but meet they did, and they were married on the 27th of August in 1871. The couple eventually went on to have 5 sons and 5 daughters. John was a drayman for a brewery and Sarah was a midwife. And from what I could find, both were illiterate. Now, the fact that Sarah was a midwife is mind blowing to me, considering the path that her life would take. Anyway, it's unclear if Sarah was making a wage, and I'm gonna take a stab in the dark here and say she wasn't, because with 10 kids to care for, who's got time to work? So I'm going to assume here that John was the breadwinner. So somewhere along the line, John hurt himself and was unable to support the family because he couldn't work. So there was no money coming in to support the huge Makin family, all 12 of them. So the stressed and desperate couple did what any of us would do in this dire situation. Sarcasm alert. Turn to baby farming. Now, John went about answering ads from desperate parents needing care for their little ones and often negotiated payment of between £3 and £5 and signed papers absolving him as the father from any further responsibility. Now, we have to remember, listeners, that Australia in the 1800s was tough, really tough, and there was no support or benefits that we can access today. Young mothers with babies born out of wedlock were often on their own with no support, and most mothers let their babies be farmed out because they thought they were doing the right thing and helping their child have a better life than they could give them. Also, the mortality rates for babies was high. So if a mother was seen without her baby, even though she just had one, no one really questioned it because unfortunately babies dying back then wasn't uncommon. And again, the mortality rates for babies being separated from their mothers were so high, most public institutions were reluctant to take them on. This this horrible tear in society's moral fabric was a perfect situation, a perfect storm for vultures like the Makins to swoop in and take on the babies other carers wouldn't. And this brings us to the heartbreaking story of Amber Murray, an 18-year-old woman who had her son Horace out of wedlock. Now, Amber, being a young 18-year-old lady rather, was struggling with providing for her young son and eventually made the decision to put an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald, which is a Sydney-based newspaper, in which she stated she was seeking a kind and loving mother to care for her son. She also wrote that she was happy to pay a weekly fee for her boy's care. Now, the Makins, ready to swoop whenever an opportunity presented itself, replied to her ad stating they were living in the Sydney suburb of Redfern and would happily care for her baby boy for 10 shillings a week. Now, Amber and baby Horace paid the family a visit in their Redfern property, and from all reports, the Makins and 2 of their daughters fell in love with little 3-month-old Horace on the spot. They doted on the little boy and claimed that they would shower him with love and attention, especially since they had only just lost a little baby boy of their own. Well, that's the story they fed Amber anyway. Amber questioned the number of babies already in the house. There were 4 or 5 or 6 babies in the house at that time, but she was told they were friends' babies and the family were only caring for them for the day. Feeling her son was in good hands, she left her little baby Horace with the Makins on the agreement that she would pay a weekly fee for his care, and she could come see him from time to time and see how her little boy was thriving. Now, sadly and heartbreakingly, and I know I keep using that word, but that is really the only word I can use to describe this situation. That was the last time Amber saw her little baby Horace alive. Now, John Makin called in each week, of course, right on time to collect his 10 shillings. But whenever Amber asked if she could see her boy, it was always met with an excuse. She never got to see her boy, but John, right on time, was there to get his money, but would never say to Amber, sure, come on down, you can see your baby. John mentioned to Amber that the family were moving from Redfern to another Western Sydney suburb called Hurstville, maybe 20 minutes, half hour away, and would forward her the address after they had settled, and then she could finally see her little baby boy. Naturally, he still collected his fee during all of this, but the Makins didn't move to Hurstville. No, they didn't. Instead, they moved to a house in McDonaldtown in the dead of night. And when they made this move in the dead of night, little baby Horace was nowhere to be found. In fact, their daughter, Clarice, would later give damning evidence at their trial that baby Horace was nowhere to be seen, and he had in fact not been part of the move to McDonaldtown. So in the backyard of the house in McDonaldtown, the house that the Makins had just deserted, drainer James Hanoe, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was there to clear a blockage. Now, James was digging in the ground to clear an underground drain when he found the cause of the blockage, which was 2 bundles of foul-smelling cloves. But not just any cloves, baby cloves. He removed the clothing and found wrapped inside the clothing the decomposing remains of 2 little babies. Horrified, James quickly called the police, who uncovered another 5 babies, all in various stages of decomposition, buried in various places in the backyard. Now, the police looked through tenancy records and found the previous tenants of the property, the ones who had taken off in the middle of the night, which of course were our friends 50-year-old John and 47-year-old Sarah Makin. Now, the Makins weren't that smart in covering their tracks, and police quickly found them in their brand new rental in Chippendale. I guess landlords back in the day didn't check if you owed rent because they never seemed to have a problem finding somewhere to live. But they were found in their new rental in Chippendale, where it seems they didn't muck around because police found more babies buried in that backyard, as well as more babies buried in previous properties the family had lived in prior to the McDonaldtown address, bringing the grand total to a grisly 12 babies murdered by the Makins, even though some claim it could be 13 or even 14. The bodies were so badly decomposed, it made identifying these little babies impossible, and same went for the cause of death. That they could not determine a cause of death, though it was thought some of the babies were murdered by being pierced by a knitting needle through the heart. Only 2 of the babies were identified, one being the baby of a couple by the name of Harice Bottomley and Minnie Davis, and the other, of course, little baby Harice Murray, the son of young mum Amber Murray, the 18-year-old who I mentioned earlier in the episode, who trusted the Makins to care for her little baby boy. Now, interestingly enough, Harice and Minnie, unlike Amber, did get to see their little baby while the baby was in the care of the Makins. Apparently, they got to see their little baby every Saturday night. Now, when their little one fell ill, John Makin informed the parents that, their baby had fallen ill and he had been taken to a doctor. A telegram soon followed after advising them that sadly, the little baby, their child, had passed away. They even accepted the Makin's offer to arrange a burial for the little one, but I'm guessing it wasn't the burial the grieving mum and dad had in mind. Now, the entire Makin family was arrested, and when I say entire, I mean entire. Adults and kids, all arrested. Sarah and John, along with their kids, Florence, who was 17, Clarice, who was 16, Blanche, who was 14, and 11-year-old Daisy, were all arrested. And John and Sarah were charged with murder, with the pair to be tried for the murder of young Harris Murray and another unknown child. And I couldn't find any information on who this child was. But they were charged with the murder of baby Harris Murray, Amber's little baby, and another unknown child. How they were charged for two murders when there were more bodies left in their wake, I also couldn't find out. I don't know the reasoning behind that. Now, often referred to the great baby farming case in Sydney newspapers, the trial was held in Sydney Supreme Court and the courthouse was packed each day with crowds all wanting to see the baby farmers turn to killers in person. Now, the Makin's defence tried to paint the couple as a professional, caring couple who had only the child's best interests at heart. They were professional childminders. They loved looking after babies, charging the parents, a weekly fee to care for her child until the mother came to either collect her child or adopt her baby out. They were doing a community service. They were helping people. The Makins even at one point denied ever having cared for anyone else's children or having taken any payments for caring for babies, let alone murdering any babies. It was absolute insanity for them to even sit there and say that when the proof was right in front of them. The defence went on to say that the Makins let the mothers visit their babies, organising weekly visits, even after the child had found a new home in some cases. They thought of themselves as the wingman for adoption or the go-between. I can't look after my baby. I'll help your baby until we can find someone to adopt your baby. That kind of wingman, but you pay me to help you. They honestly thought they were doing a good thing. They had done no wrong, and the fact that they were still at some stages throughout their trial denying even having cared for anyone else's baby is it's absolute insanity. Now, the prosecution told a different story, and this story was that the Makins found it easier and more profitable to murder these babies and keep collecting the fees they were being paid to care for these babies than just looking after the babies or, heaven forbid, getting a job that doesn't involve murdering babies. They then prevented the mothers from seeing their babies because their babies were dead. So when Amber's saying, hey, can I please see my baby? They know they can't because he's buried in the backyard. So they would stop the mothers through lies and deception. So the star witness, and this is where things get really interesting, the star witness for the prosecution was Clarice Makin. That's right, John and Sarah's daughter. She took the stand and tore the story that the defense was trying to paint of the Makins being caring and professional and just misunderstood to pieces. She told how she had pawned the baby's clothes for her parents, and this claim was backed up by testimony that Amber Murray herself and other grieving mothers gave, who identified clothing that had been pawned by Sarah Makin as clothing that belonged to their little ones. Clarice also stated that some of the clothing belonging to the dead babies as having been in her mother Sarah's possession. 11-year-old Daisy Makin also took the stand and said that only two babies had accompanied the family to had accompanied the family when they moved from McDonaldtown to Redfern, and she never saw little Horace Murray when that move happened. She never saw him as he was already dead and buried at the McDonaldtown house. So the McDonaldtown house is where the babies were discovered, and they moved to Redfern and eventually were arrested. Now, the judge didn't buy the story of the Makins being innocent do-gooders, helping out desperate mothers and couples in their time of need. Oh, no. He didn't buy that for one bit. He found the pair guilty of murder of baby Horace and baby Doe. And when the guilty verdict was announced, Sarah sobbed bitterly on her husband's shoulder and accused their daughter Clarice of being the reason for the guilty verdict. She carried on that much. She was eventually removed from the court. John remained unmoved and emotionless. John was sentenced to death while the judge applied for mercy for Sarah, and she was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour. Justice Stevens said, quote, "You took money from the mother of this child. You beguiled her with promises which you never meant to perform and which you never did perform, having determined on the death of the child. You deceived her as to your address, and you endeavoured to make it utterly fruitless that any search should be made, and finally, in order to make detection impossible, as you thought, having bereft it of life, you carried this child in your yard as you would the carcass of a dog." No one who has heard the case but must believe that you were engaged in baby farming in its worst aspect. 3 yards of houses in which you lived testify with that ghastly evidence of these bodies that you were carrying on this nefarious, this hellish business of destroying the lives of these infants for the sake of gain. Now, as I'd stated before, Sarah was sentenced to life in prison, which she served at Bathurst and in Sydney. Now, for whatever reasons only known to them, her daughters petitioned for early release in 1907 and again in 1911. And on 29th of April in 1911, she was discharged to the care of her daughter Florence on the grounds of her great age and declining health. She nursed her eldest daughter through a fatal illness and then lived with her son-in-law. She died on the 13th of September 1918 at Marrickville and was buried in Sydney's Rookwood Cemetery. She was survived by 3 sons and 4 daughters. John Makin was hanged on the 15th of August in 1893 at Sydney Jail. From what I could see, the pair never showed any remorse for their actions, never apologised to the mothers or the families of the babies they killed for the grief they caused and the life-altering decisions they made for those babies and their parents. Now, there is a little bit of good news in this horrific case, because the case of John and Sarah Makin and their horrific actions raised awareness of the institution of baby farming and led the New South Wales Legislative Assembly to initiate the Children's Protection Act of 1892. And this was to bring the care of orphaned and destitute children under state control. Now, also the story of Amber Murray is not unknown, and the Makin family, and it inspired the 2008 Australian theatre production The Hatpin, which played in Sydney and in New York. Now, in 2009, it was nominated for 3 Sydney Theatre Awards and won 1 for Best Actress. Now, I can only hope that the parents of these babies who were murdered by the Makins went on to live happy and beautiful and blessed lives, and if they did have more children, I hope they got to enjoy every single moment with their little babies and watch them grow and watch them live beautiful and happy lives, because that is all they wanted for their babies that were murdered. And to try your hardest to do what you are thinking is right for your child, and to have that happen as a result, I can't imagine as a parent how you could ever get over that or ever forgive yourself for that. So I do hope they did go on to have rich and fulfilling lives, blessed with as many babies as they could handle. I really truly do. And that's it, guys. That is episode 2, all wrapped up for Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans. The story of John and Sarah Makin, baby farmers, murderers, monsters. I hope you have enjoyed it. I really do. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. Thank you all so much. You are all rock stars. Thank you for listening. And until next time, guys, stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated.